The gate to the Circle W Ranch had never been closed to Daniel Wallace in his whole life. Not once. Not even the night he rode home drunk and grieving after his mother's funeral. So when he came up the wagon road at midday with the smell of dust and distant smoke on the wind, and found the gate not only closed but chained, and a hand-lettered sign nailed crooked to the post, he thought at first that his eyes were playing tricks born of 3 weeks in the saddle. Cedar Spring Homestead Cooperative, the sign read. By order of the Territorial Court, Lawrence County, Dakota Territory. No trespassing by cattle interests. Beyond the gate, where his father's longhorns had grazed since before Daniel was born, a herd of goats moved across the yellowed grass, bells clanking softly at their throats, and a woman stood among them with a rifle broken open over her forearm, watching him the way a person watches a rattlesnake sunning on a warm rock, not afraid exactly, but not about to look away either. Daniel swung down from his horse slower than he meant to. His knees ached from the drive up from Ogallala, and his mind was doing something strange, trying to fit the goats and the sign and the woman into a world that had made sense 3 weeks ago. This is Wallace land, he said, and even to his own ears his voice sounded thinner than he intended. It was, the woman said. Most of it still is if your father's debts get settled honest, but the spring and the 80 acres around it belong to the cooperative now, filed and recorded in Deadwood a month past. You're standing on cooperative ground this very moment, Mr. Wallace, in case nobody told you. It was the way she said his name that finally placed her for him, a flat, deliberate courtesy, like a woman naming a disease rather than a man. He looked at her properly then. Dark hair escaping a braid under a wide gray hat, sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the heat, boots worn through at the toe from real work and not show, and a face he remembered, though 2 years had sharpened it, worn some of the softness from the cheeks and put something harder and more certain in the eyes. Miss Ellsworth, he said, and felt the old shame climb up the back of his neck like a fever. You remember me then? I remember. Good, Irene Ellsworth said. Then you'll remember what you told me, standing in that very yard behind you, when I came asking your father honest questions about the water. You called me a lying newspaper skirt who ought to go back east and mind a husband, if I could find one fool enough to have me. You told your father's men to run me off the property, and one of them put a quirt to my horse to see that I went. Daniel's jaw worked. He had told himself in the years since that the memory had softened, that he had been young and cruel in the particular way of men who have never once had to earn what they were given. Hearing it spoken back to him in her voice, plain and unadorned, he understood that it had not softened at all. It had only waited. I was wrong to say it, he said. I have been wrong about a great many things, it appears, while I've been gone. You have, she agreed, and there was no forgiveness in it, only fact. Your father is dead, Mr. Wallace, buried 3 weeks now in the county cemetery outside Belle Fourche because there was no money left in the estate for a plot up on the ranch. I expect nobody rode out to tell you on account of nobody knew where you'd gone. The sun seemed to tilt sideways. Daniel put a hand on his horse's neck to steady himself, and the animal shifted, sensing the tremor in him. Dead, he repeated. How? His heart, the doctor said, though I have heard men say shame will do the same work as a bad heart in time. She studied him, and something in her face eased just slightly, though her voice did not. I am sorry to be the one to tell you plain in a dirt yard. I would have done it kinder if I had known you were riding up today. But I did not think kindness was owed to a Wallace until I saw your face just now and understood you truly did not know. Daniel looked past her, past the goats and the cooperative's canvas tents pitched along the tree line where the spring ran, and out toward the low brown hills where his father's cattle should have been grazing and were not. Smoke, thin and gray, smudged the horizon to the southwest, a wildfire burning somewhere in the pine brakes, the kind of thing a man learned to watch all through a Dakota August whether he wanted to or not. I need to understand what has happened here, he said. All of it. I am asking you to tell me, Miss Ellsworth, though I have no right to ask you for anything. No, she agreed. You do not. But she latched the rifle closed over her arm, not raised, only closed, and something in the set of her shoulders told him she had decided, at least for the moment, that he was not a threat worth shooting. Ride to Belle Fourche. Ask for Tobias Reyes at the livery. He worked your father 30 years, and he will tell you what I cannot, because I only know the second half of the story. He knew your father before either of us were born. She turned then, whistling low to call the nearest of the homestead women to help move the goats off the flat where a wagon was coming through, and Daniel Wallace stood alone at the chained gate of the only home he had ever known, understanding for the first time in his life what it meant to have nothing. Tobias Reyes had a face like old harness leather and hands that shook faintly now, from age or from grief. Daniel could not tell which. He set down the horseshoe he had been shaping and looked at Daniel for a long moment before he spoke. You look like him, Tobias said. Younger, but you carry your shoulders the same. He carried them like a man expecting to be struck. Tell me what happened, Tobias. All of it. I have heard the barest edges from Miss Ellsworth, and I would rather have the whole truth from a man who loved him than pieces from a woman who has good reason to hate him. Tobias wiped his hands on his apron and gestured Daniel to a bench in the shade of the livery overhang. Your father and Gideon Marsh went into a scheme together 3 years back, when the drought first started biting hard. Cedar Spring is the only water in 40 miles that does not run dry by August. You know that better than most. There were homestead families filed on land around it, honest filings, going back to 79 and 80. Your father and Marsh paid a land office clerk in Deadwood to misfile the water rights, to make it look as though the spring itself sat on Circle W deeded ground, when the survey plainly showed otherwise if a man looked close. They ran off 2 families with threats and bought out a third for less than the land was worth, and they split the water between them, your father taking the lion's share since the spring sits closest to Circle W fence line. And I knew none of this, Daniel said, though even as he said it, doubt crept up his spine. He remembered strange visitors at odd hours, ledgers his father kept locked, a night 2 years back when he had asked why the Havorson family had sold out and moved on so sudden, and his father had told him to mind cattle and leave business to men who understood it. You suspected, Tobias said gently, no unkindness in it, only truth. I watched you suspect, and I watched you decide it was easier not to ask twice. That is not the same sin as your father's, but it is a sin, Daniel, and you know it, or you would not be sitting there looking like a man confessing to a priest. Daniel said nothing for a long moment. Outside, a wagon rattled past on the road, and somewhere a dog barked at nothing. The woman, he said finally, Ellsworth. She came out from Chicago near 2 years back, writing for one of the Eastern papers about homestead fraud in the territories, and somebody in Yankton told her Lawrence County had a story worth chasing. She found the Havorsons living in a soddy outside Sturgis, half-starved, and she got their whole account, and she went and found the clerk in Deadwood too, and put the fear of exposure in him until he broke and told the truth of the filing. She built the case slow, over better than a year, gathering signed statements, riding out here more than once to ask your father to answer for it honest, and getting nothing for her trouble but insults and a quirt across her mare's flank the day you spoke to her. And the court believed her. The court had no choice. She brought the clerk's confession, and the Havorsons, and the original survey plat that Marsh's own man had altered, badly enough that a blind judge could see the seams of it. The court voided the fraudulent filing and returned the spring and the ground around it to the homestead families, organized now as a cooperative, since none of them alone had money enough to hold the land against a man like Marsh on their own. Your father's estate owes restitution on top of it, which is why there is nothing left for you to inherit, Daniel, saving the house itself and the west section, and even that will likely go to pay what's owed before the year is out. Daniel looked down at his own hands, brown and calloused from 3 weeks of trail work, and thought of all the money he had sent home over the years believing it went to build something lasting, and how instead it had gone to pay for his father's part in stealing water from families with children. "And Marsh," he said. "What became of him?" Tobias's face changed, went careful in a way it had not been before. "Marsh lost his claim to the spring same as your father in the ruling. But Marsh is not a man who loses easy, and he did not go to his knees weeping the way your father did before he died. Marsh still runs 8,000 head on the range south of here, and every one of them needs water same as it always did. I would not put it past him to try again, by some other road, if the court's ruling should ever look shaky. You would do well to watch that man, Daniel, more careful than you ever watched your own father." Daniel rose from the bench and thanked the old man, and rode back out toward the ranch he no longer owned with a weight on him that felt, for the first time in his prideful life, entirely earned. He found Irene Ellsworth kneeling at the edge of the spring pool that evening, filling a line of tin buckets for the goats, her sleeves soaked to the elbow and her hat pushed back off her face. She did not startle when his shadow fell over her, only glanced up and went on with her work. "I have talked with Tobias," Daniel said. "I know the whole of it now, or near enough. And what have you come to tell me, Mr. Wallace? That you are ashamed, that you did not know?" "Men have been telling me both those things about their fathers and their brothers for 2 years now, and it has never once put water back in a dry ditch." "I have come to ask for work," Daniel said. Irene set down the bucket she was holding and looked at him properly for the first time since he had ridden up that morning. Somewhere behind her, goats bleated and shifted in the blue evening light, and the smell of wood smoke drifted faint on the wind from the southwest, where the wildfire still burned somewhere out past the pine ridges. "You want work," she repeated, as though testing the words for a hidden blade. "From the cooperative that your father tried to ruin." "Herding goats, Mr. Wallace, because that is the only work here to be had, and it does not pay in coin, only in food and a bunk in the tool shed, and whatever your conscience decides it is worth. I know what I am asking." "Do you?" She stood, wiping her hands on her skirt, and for a moment the old anger flared plain in her face. "You insulted me in this very yard 2 years ago, in front of your father's men, in front of God, and you meant every word of it. Now your family's fortune is gone, and you come asking the woman you insulted for a job herding goats, and you expect me to say yes because you have had a hard 3 weeks and a harder day." "I expect nothing," Daniel said, and meant it. "I am asking because I do not know how else to begin making right what my family did, and because I do not have anywhere else in this territory that will have me. If you say no, I will ride on, and I will not trouble you or this cooperative again. But I am asking." For a long moment Irene said nothing at all, only studied him with that same flat, assessing look she had given him at the gate that morning, as though she were reading a document for a lie hidden between the lines. "There is a Norwegian family here, the Brants," she said finally. "Their boy Peter is 13 and has been herding goats alone since his father broke his leg falling from a hay wagon a fortnight back. If you can convince Anders Brant himself that you will not run off with his herd or beat his boy for asking questions, I will not stand in the way of it. But understand me, Daniel Wallace. I require honesty from any man who works this ground before I will ever give him trust, and I have found that most men would rather die than give an honest account of themselves. If you lie to me, even once, even small, you will be gone from this cooperative before the sun sets that same day." "I will not lie to you," Daniel said. "We will see," said Irene Ellsworth, and turned back to her buckets. And that was the whole of it. No handshake, no welcome, only the goats bleating in the blue dark and the far smell of smoke on the wind. Anders Brant turned out to be a broad, weathered man with a splinted leg propped on a crate outside his soddy, and eyes that missed nothing. "You are Elias Wallace's boy," he said, before Daniel had finished dismounting. "I am. My family sold out to your father for less than our claim was worth, 2 years back, after his riders came at night and shot 3 of our best milk goats and left them dead in the pen for us to find come morning. We went as Sturgis near broke, and only came back this spring when Miss Ellsworth's suit gave us the chance to file again, honest this time." Anders looked at him a long while. "Why should I let you near what is left of my herd?" "Because I am not asking to be trusted for who my father was," Daniel said. "I am asking for a chance to be judged for what I do, starting now, and if I fail you, you may run me off this land yourself, leg or no leg, and I will not raise a hand against it." Something in Anders's face shifted, not to warmth, but to a kind of grudging respect for a man willing to be measured plain. "Peter will show you the herd come morning," he said. "You will sleep in the tool shed, and you will eat what we eat, which some days is not much. And if I hear one word from my boy that you have spoken cruel to him, or handled the animals rough, you will answer to me and then to every family in this cooperative, and there are more of us than you think." "Fair enough," Daniel said and offered his hand, and after a moment Anders Brandt took it. The goats, Daniel came to learn over the following days, were nothing at all like cattle, and everything he thought he knew about herding proved half useless against them. Cattle moved in a mass, dumb and biddable if you knew the pressure points, but goats scattered and climbed and questioned every fence a man ever built, testing weak wire with their teeth and their curious noses, slipping through gaps a rabbit would have envied. Peter Brandt, 13 and solemn beyond his years, taught him more in 3 days than 30 years of cattle work ever had. "You have to think like they think," Peter told him, crouched at the edge of a rocky draw where 3 nannies had wedged themselves halfway up a cliff face after a stand of chokecherry bushes. "Cattle only want grass and water. Goats want to see what's on the other side of things. You cannot herd curiosity with a rope, Mr. Wallace. You have to give it somewhere better to go." Daniel found, to his own surprise, that he liked the work. There was an honesty in it that cattle ranching, with all its capital and mortgages and market speculation, had never quite possessed. A goat did not care what a man's father had done. A goat only wanted good browse, clean water, and a herder patient enough to understand it. By the end of the first week, his hands were scratched from chokecherry thorns and his boots ruined from climbing rock, and he had not felt so plainly useful in years. Irene watched him from a careful distance those first days, though Daniel noticed her watching, the way a man notices weather changing even with his back turned. She came by the herd in the morning, sometimes on her way to interview homestead families for what she called her continuing account, a long article she meant to send east once the story reached its proper end, and she would stop and observe him work without comment, and then move on. It was on the 5th day that she finally spoke to him, beyond the necessary business of the cooperative. "Peter says you have a gift for it," she said, appearing at the edge of the browse field with a notebook tucked under her arm, her boots dusty from the morning's walking. "He says you listen to the herd instead of fighting it." "Peter is a generous teacher," Daniel said. "I have fallen down 2 ravines and torn my good shirt on a fence, and the nannies still do not entirely trust me." "Goats are slow to trust," Irene said, and there was the faintest thread of humor in it, gone almost before he caught it. "It seems to be a trait shared by a good many creatures on this ground." "I have noticed that also," Daniel said, and risked a small smile and was rewarded briefly by something that was almost the ghost of one crossing her own face before she caught it back. "I am writing an account of the cooperative," she said, businesslike again. "The Brandts, the 2 other families, how the water has changed things for them since the ruling. I do not intend to write about you, Mr. Wallace, in case you wondered." "I did not wonder," Daniel said. "I would not expect it." "Good," Irene said, and there was something almost like relief in her voice, as though she had been bracing for an argument that had not come. "Because I do not know yet what to make of you, and I do not put things I have not made sense of into print." She left him then, walking back toward the cooperative's cluster of tents and the one half-built cabin the families were raising together before winter, and Daniel stood watching her go longer than he meant to, and told himself it was only curiosity, the same curiosity Peter said the goats felt about the world, wanting to see what lay on the other side of a woman who required a man to earn every inch of her regard. The wind changed on the 9th day Daniel worked the herd, swinging hard out of the southwest sometime past noon, and with it came the smell of smoke thick enough to taste, and a strange orange cast to the sunlight that every soul raised on that dry ground knew to fear. Daniel was up in the rocky draw with the herd when he saw it, a wall of gray-black smoke boiling up over the pine ridge not 4 miles off, moving faster than any fire he had seen in his life, driven by a wind that had turned in an hour from a nuisance to a weapon. He did not wait to think it through. He whistled the herd together, using the calls Peter had taught him, and drove them hard down out of the draw and across the flat toward the cooperative's tents, shouting as he went for anyone in earshot. "Fire! Fire coming from the ridge, moving fast, get the wagons loaded." The cooperative erupted into ordered panic, the kind born of families who had faced this danger before and drilled for it without ever saying so aloud. Anders Brandt, leg still splinted, directed his wife and Peter to the wagon, while Daniel and 2 other men began cutting the goats loose from their picket lines, driving them toward the creek crossing where the cooperative had agreed. In some earlier council Daniel had not been present for, that safety lay in the wet ground and open gravel bars where fire could not easily follow. It was Irene who found him there, soaked to the knee in creek water, physically wrestling a stubborn billy goat that had decided the fire was less frightening than the deep water crossing. "The Havorson wagon has broken an axle a half-mile up the trail," she shouted over the rising wind, her face streaked with ash already, her hat gone somewhere in the chaos. "They have 2 children and the grandmother cannot walk far. I am going for them." "Not alone," Daniel said, and there was no argument in him, only certainty, and something in his voice must have carried enough of that certainty that Irene did not waste breath disputing it. They rode together up the smoke-choked trail, embers beginning to drift down around them like some terrible black snow, and found the Havorson wagon exactly where Irene had said, tilted hard on its broken axle, the mother trying uselessly to calm 2 crying children while the grandmother sat rigid on the buckboard, too frightened to move. Daniel was down off his horse before it had fully stopped. "We cannot fix the axle, there's no time. We ride double now, all of you." "My chickens," the mother said, half hysterical, gesturing at a crate lashed to the wagon bed. "Leave them," Irene said, not unkindly but with an authority that cut through the woman's panic like a blade. "You cannot buy back your children if the fire takes this trail. Leave the chickens and come now." Between them they got the grandmother up onto Irene's horse, frail arms locked around Irene's waist, and Daniel took the 2 children up before him on his own saddle, while the mother ran alongside holding the youngest child's foot in the stirrup for balance. And in that terrible half-hour, with smoke rolling black overhead and the roar of the fire growing audible even over the wind, Daniel Wallace understood in his body what he had only understood before in his mind. That a man's worth was not in the name stamped on a ranch gate, but in what he did with his hands and his horse when someone else's children needed carrying to safety. They reached the creek crossing just as the first wall of flame crested the ridge behind them, and the cooperative together watched from the wet gravel bars as the fire raced along the dry grass toward the water, and then, checked by the damp ground in the creek itself, curled away south along the ridgeline instead, sparing the homestead buildings by a margin no wider than a quarter mile. It was full dark before the immediate danger passed, the fire burning itself out against the natural firebreak of the creek and a stretch of rocky ground beyond, and the cooperative gathered exhausted and soot-streaked around a cold camp, afraid to light even a cook fire that night. Daniel found himself sitting apart from the others, tending a rope burn on his palm from hauling wagon gear, when Irene Ellsworth came and sat beside him without asking permission, which he had already begun to understand was simply her way. "You did not have to ride up that trail with me," she said. "I did not consider not riding," Daniel said. "It did not feel like a choice in the moment. It only felt like the thing that had to happen next." Irene looked at him for a long moment in the dim light of the stars, her face still smudged with ash, and something in her expression had changed since the morning. Some careful wall lowered by a degree that he could not have named but felt plainly. "I misjudged how much use you would be," she said. "I want to say that plainly, since I have required honesty of you, and it would be poor of me to withhold it myself. I thought you had come here to make yourself feel less guilty for a season, and would ride off again once the guilt wore thin. I did not think you would ride into a wildfire for people you had never met a fortnight past." "I am not certain I knew it myself until I was doing it," Daniel admitted. "I have spent most of my life being told I was owed things, Miss Ellsworth. It turns out I am considerably more used to the world doing the opposite." Irene almost smiled then, a real one this time, small and tired but real. "You may call me Irene," she said, "if we are to go on herding goats and fighting fires together. Miss Ellsworth is a great deal of syllables for a woman covered in soot." "Irene," Daniel said, and something warm moved through him at the sound of her given name in his own mouth, entirely separate from the ache of exhaustion and the smell of smoke still clinging to them both. "Then you should know me as Daniel, if it is honesty you are after, and not merely Wallace, which is a name I am no longer certain I want to carry proud." "Daniel," she said, trying it, and nodded once, as though filing it carefully away in the same notebook where she kept every other fact she had gathered that mattered. They did not speak of anything deeper that night. There was too much work left in simply surviving until morning, counting goats, checking on the frightened children, taking turns keeping watch against the chance of the wind turning the fire back. But something had shifted between them at the creek's edge, some ledger balanced by a fraction, and Daniel Wallace lay awake long after Irene had finally gone to sleep near the Havorson children, watching the last orange glow of the dying fire on the southern ridge, and thought that he had not, in all his life, felt so entirely certain of anything as he felt certain now, that he wanted to be worthy of the trust she was only just beginning to extend. It was 3 days after the fire, while the cooperative was still assessing the damage to fence lines and outbuildings, that Daniel found the first hard evidence that the danger had not passed with the flames. He was mending wire along the southern boundary, the section closest to Gideon Marsh's range, when he came across boot prints in the soft ash-blackened ground that did not match any boot in the cooperative, deep-heeled prints made by a man who rode for wages and walked heavy, and beside them the clear mark of a struck match, 6 of them, scattered in a rough line along what had once been dry grass before the fire took it. He rode back to camp at a hard gallop, and found Irene interviewing the Havorson grandmother about her recollection of the original land dispute for the article, and pulled her aside without ceremony. "The fire did not start on its own," he said, low enough the old woman would not hear. "There are matches struck in a line along the south boundary, and boot prints that belong to no one in this cooperative. Someone set that fire deliberate, Irene, and set it to burn toward the homestead, not away from it." Irene's face went very still, the reporter's caution settling over her features like a mask drawn tight. "Show me." They rode out together, and she crouched over the evidence with the same careful attention Daniel had watched her give to the ledgers and depositions she kept in her trunk, photographing the scene in her mind, the way another woman might have with one of the new cameras. "Marsh," she said finally. "It has his mark on it, though he is far too careful a man to have struck the matches himself. He will have paid some rider to do it, someone desperate enough or loyal enough not to talk." She looked up at Daniel, and there was a grim understanding passing between them now, the shared recognition of a danger neither of them could face alone. "The final hearing on the water rights is in 11 days, in Deadwood, before Judge Ambrose Kirtland. It was meant to be a formality, confirming the cooperative's title once and for all, now that the initial ruling has stood a year without challenge. If Marsh is willing to burn us out beforehand, it means he believes he still has a chance to overturn it, or he means to make certain there is no cooperative left standing to defend the ruling at all. Then we need proof of what he has done," Daniel said. Proof strong enough that Judge Kirtland cannot look past it, and we need it before 11 days pass." "There will be a ledger," Irene said slowly, thinking aloud in the particular way Daniel had come to recognize as her mind working through evidence like a woman laying bricks. "Marsh is careful, but careful men keep records, if only to be certain their own hired hands do not cheat them. If your father kept books on the original fraud, and I believe he did since the clerk in Deadwood testified to payments received, then Marsh will have kept a matching set. Would your father have kept such papers at the ranch house?" "He kept a strongbox in the study," Daniel said. "I know where the key is hidden or was before I left. If any of it still exists, it would be there." They rode to the Circle W ranch house together that same afternoon, past the goats grazing where cattle once had, past the gate with its cooperative sign, and let themselves into the house that had gone half to dust in the week since Elias Wallace's death, sheets thrown over furniture, the air stale with disuse. Daniel found the key exactly where he remembered, taped beneath the lip of his father's desk, and the strongbox itself in the bottom drawer of the same desk, and his hands shook faintly as he worked the lock, uncertain whether he hoped to find nothing at all or everything. Inside were letters, dozens of them, correspondence between Elias Wallace and Gideon Marsh spanning 3 years, discussing the diversion of the spring, payments to the land office clerk, and in the most recent letters, dated only months before Elias' death, a growing anxiety in his father's hand about Marsh's insistence on continuing the scheme, even after Irene Ellsworth had begun asking questions. And near the bottom, a single letter in Marsh's own hand, dated after Elias Wallace's death, addressed to a man named Silas Prout, discussing payment for a task described only as ensuring the Homestead families reconsider their position on the Cedar Spring matter before the Deadwood hearing. "This is it," Irene breathed, holding the letter with the careful reverence of a woman handling the exact proof she had spent 2 years chasing. "This names the man he hired, Daniel, Silas Prout. If we can find him and get him to testify, or find the land office clerk to confirm Marsh's hand alongside your father's, we can bring this before Judge Kirtland and end it for good." It was at that moment, with the letter still in Irene's hand, that they heard horses in the yard outside, more than one, moving at a deliberate walk that spoke of men in no hurry because they believed themselves already in control of the situation. Daniel moved to the window and felt his stomach drop. 4 riders sat their horses in the yard, and at their center, unmistakable even after 2 years, sat Gideon Marsh himself, a heavy man with a gray mustache and cold, pale eyes, flanked by hired guns Daniel did not recognize. "They followed us," Irene said quietly, tucking the letters swiftly inside her jacket. "Or they have been watching the house all along, waiting to see if anyone came looking." "There is a back door through the kitchen," Daniel said. "It lets out to the horse pen. If we can reach our mounts, Wallace." Marsh's voice carried easily through the old walls of the house, confident and unhurried. "I know you are in there, boy, and I expect the newspaper woman is with you. No need for anyone to play at hiding. I have only come to talk business, seeing as this house and everything in it belongs, by right, to a debt I am still owed." Daniel and Irene exchanged one look, and in it passed an entire conversation neither of them had time to speak aloud. Then Daniel took her hand, and together they moved fast and low through the kitchen, out the back door into the yard where their horses stood tied at the pen, and were mounted and riding before Marsh's men had fully rounded the corner of the house. A shot rang out behind them, deliberately high, a warning rather than an attempt to strike, and Marsh's voice bellowed after them across the widening distance. "You cannot outrun what is coming, boy. Your father learned that lesson too late to matter." They rode hard for 2 miles before either of them dared slow the pace, and when they finally did, on a rise overlooking the cooperative's camp with the letters still safe inside Irene's jacket, both of them breathing hard from more than the exertion of the ride, Daniel finally spoke what had been building in his chest since the shot rang out. He knows we have something now. He will not wait for the hearing to act again." "No," Irene agreed, her hands not quite steady as she reached to touch the letters through the fabric of her coat, reassuring herself they were still there. "We need Silas Prute, and we need him before Marsh finds a way to silence him first, if Prute is even still willing to talk after doing Marsh's dirty work already once. Where would a man like that be found? Deadwood, most likely, or one of the mining camps nearby. Men like Prute drift between wage work for ranchers and work in the gulches when money runs thin. I have a contact there, an editor at the Black Hills Pioneer who has helped me before with tips on where certain men can be found, for the price of an exclusive account once the story breaks." Daniel looked at the smoke still hanging faint on the horizon from the wildfire days before, and thought of the 11 days remaining until the hearing, and understood that time had become the most valuable and most dangerous thing either of them possessed. They brought the letters to Sheriff Cobb in Bell Forge the following morning, a lean, careful man who read through the correspondence twice before setting it down on his desk with visible unease. "This is strong," Cobb admitted, "but a defense lawyer will call it circumstantial without a living witness to stand behind it and swear to what it means. Marsh has money enough to hire the best counsel in the territory, and money has a way of making a judge's eyes glaze over correspondence, however damning, if there is no flesh and blood testimony to go with it." "Then we find Prute," Irene said, "and the clerk, Otis Renshaw, who filed the original fraudulent claim. If Renshaw will testify a second time, confirming Marsh's involvement directly rather than only your father's, and Prute confesses to setting the fire on Marsh's payment, no lawyer in the territory can wave that away as circumstance." Sheriff Cobb studied them both for a long moment. "Renshaw left the land office 2 months back, moved to Deadwood proper, works some clerking job for a freight company now, last I heard. Finding Prute will be harder. Men who set fires for wages do not advertise their whereabouts." "We have 11 days, Daniel said. 10 now." "Then you had best ride hard," Cobb said, "and watch your backs the whole way because Marsh knows exactly what you are looking for now, and he has a considerable head start in knowing where to hide it." It was Irene who made the decision that split them, standing outside the sheriff's office in the white morning light with the whole weight of 10 days pressing down on them both. "I need to stay," she said. "Cooperative cannot be left undefended, not with Marsh proven willing to burn us out once already. Anders cannot ride with his leg still healing, and the other men have families to protect. Someone with sense needs to be there if Marsh tries anything further before the hearing. And you mean for that someone to be you?" "I mean for it to be me because I am the one Marsh least expects to stand her ground, and because I know this fight better than anyone in that camp, having chased it 2 years. But I need you to ride to Deadwood, Daniel. You know this country, you know how to move fast and quiet, and Renshaw and Prute are more likely to speak to a man who once wore the Wallace name than to a woman from a Chicago newspaper, however unfair that truth may be." Daniel wanted badly to argue that he should be the one to stay, that he could not bear the thought of riding away and leaving her exposed to whatever Marsh might attempt next. But he had learned enough of her in these past weeks to know that such an argument would only insult the very courage and judgment that had first drawn his admiration, and that a woman who had faced down armed men at a gate with nothing but a broken rifle did not need a man's protection so much as she needed his trust. "I will ride within the hour," he said instead, "and I will not come back without both witnesses, or proof enough that no judge in the territory can ignore it." Irene looked at him for a long moment, and something passed over her face that was not quite fear and not quite hope, but some difficult country between the two. "Be careful," she said, and it was the first time she had said such a thing to him without any edge of doubt behind it, and Daniel carried the sound of it with him the whole hard ride to Deadwood. The road to Deadwood ran through some of the roughest country in the territory, narrow gulches and steep pine slopes still smoking faintly here and there from lightning strikes earlier that summer, and Daniel pushed his horse harder than was wise, trading a night's rest at a stage station for 4 extra hours of riding, driven by the memory of Irene's face at the parting, and by his own growing understanding that he was no longer merely trying to redeem his family's name. He was trying to become a man worthy of a woman who required the truth before she would offer her heart, and he found, somewhere on that long, dusty road, that he wanted very badly to be that man, not for her approval alone, but because he had finally glimpsed, in the goats and the fire and the letters in the strongbox, the shape of who he might become if he simply kept choosing the harder, honester path. Deadwood in the late summer of 1886 was still rough at its edges, though the wildest days of the gold rush had settled some into a town of real buildings and a proper county courthouse, gambling halls standing alongside dry goods stores and a scattering of churches. Daniel found Otis Rencho exactly where Sheriff Cobb had said, behind a freight company counter, a thin, nervous man who went pale at the mention of Gideon Marsh's name and Cedar Spring in the same breath. "I already testified once," Rencho said, glancing toward the door as though Marsh himself might walk through at any moment. "I lost my position at the land office over it. I have a wife and 2 children, Mr. Wallace. I cannot afford to make more enemies of powerful men." "You will not be making enemies," Daniel said carefully. "You will be finishing what you already started, and this time the truth will be strong enough that Marsh cannot touch you for it, because a court ruling backed by full evidence protects a man in a way that a partial ruling never can. If Marsh loses this hearing entirely, he loses the power to trouble you again." Renshaw was quiet a long moment, wringing a rag in his hands. "He confirmed the fraud himself." "Marsh did. Came to me directly 2 years back, not through your father, and told me plain what he wanted altered on the survey plat, and paid me from his own pocket, separate from what your father paid. I have always known that made it his scheme as much as Elias Wallace's, maybe more, since it was Marsh's idea from the start. Your father only agreed to go along. Will you swear to that before Judge Kirtland in 9 days' time?" Renshaw looked at him a long while, and something in his thin, nervous face firmed, some decision arriving at last after 2 years of quiet fear. "I will," he said. "I have carried it long enough. I would rather carry the truth from here forward." Finding Silas Prout proved harder, and took the better part of 3 days, tracking rumor from one mining camp to another through the gulches outside Deadwood, until Daniel finally found him half-drunk in a boarding house on the edge of Central City, a haggard man with haunted eyes who broke into tears before Daniel had finished explaining why he had come. "I did not want to do it," Prout said, his voice cracking. "Marsh paid me $40, more money than I had seen in a year, and told me only to set a fire that would scare some homestead families off their claim, said nobody would be hurt, said it would burn out before it reached the buildings. But I saw the smoke that night, saw how fast it moved, and I have not slept right since, thinking of those children in that camp, thinking what might have happened if the creek had not stopped it." "Then testify," Daniel said, not unkindly. "Tell the judge exactly what you told me. It will not undo what you did, but it may yet save something, and it will lift a portion of what you are carrying, I think, better than whiskey ever will." Prout looked at him with something like desperate gratitude. "Marsh will kill me for it." "Marsh will have no power left to kill anyone once the court has heard the whole truth and stripped him of his standing in this territory," Daniel said, though he was not entirely certain of it himself, only certain that the alternative, silence, had already cost too much. "And I will see you safely to the courthouse and back again myself, if it comes to that." It took considerable further persuasion, and a promise from Daniel that Sheriff Cobb would provide protection once they reached Belle Fourche. But by the 4th day, Prout had agreed, sober now and shaking with something that was not entirely fear, to ride back with Daniel and give his full account before Judge Kirtland. They arrived back at the Cedar Spring Cooperative on the 8th day, 6 days before the hearing, dust-caked and saddle-sore, Renshaw and Prout trailing behind on hired horses, both men looking as though they had aged years in the space of a single journey. Irene came out from among the goats at the sound of their approach, and something in her face when she saw Daniel, safe and whole and bringing with him exactly what he had promised, broke open in a way she did not try to hide. "You found them both," she said, disbelief and relief tangled together in her voice. "I told you I would not come back without them," Daniel said, dismounting, and for a moment neither of them said anything further, only stood in the dusty yard with the goats bleating around them and the two witnesses waiting awkwardly nearby. And something passed between them that was larger than relief, larger even than the case they had built, a recognition neither of them had quite allowed themselves during the days of separation and worry. "I was afraid for you," Irene said finally, quietly, as though the words cost her something to say plain. "Every day you were gone, I told myself it was only worry for the case, for the cooperative's future. But it was not only that, Daniel. I do not think it was mostly that at all." "I felt the same," Daniel said. "Every mile back to this place, I found myself thinking not of the hearing, not even of my father's name, but of you, standing at that gate the first day I rode up with your rifle and your certainty, and I understood I did not want to spend whatever life I have left without you standing somewhere near me in it." Irene looked at him for a long, searching moment, the old caution still present but softened now by something warmer beneath it. "I require honesty," she said. "I have said it to you before, and I will say it again now, because it matters more in this moment than it ever has. Is this true, what you are telling me, or is it only the relief of a hard journey ended, speaking louder than good sense?" "It is true," Daniel said, and stepped closer, close enough that he could see the fine dust of the trail still caught in her dark hair, close enough to see her breath catch faintly at his nearness. "I have never told you a lie, Irene, not once since the day I rode up to this gate a ruined man with nothing left to offer but the truth of what I had been and what I hope to become. I love you. I do not say it lightly, and I do not say it expecting anything returned, only because it is honest, and you have taught me these past weeks that honesty is worth more than any pride I once carried." Irene's eyes shone bright in the afternoon light, and she reached up slowly and touched his face, tracing the line of a scar along his jaw that Daniel could not even remember the origin of anymore. "I love you also," she said, quiet and certain. "I did not expect to. I built my whole life these past years around not needing any man's protection or approval, and I am not offering you either of those things now, only this. I want you standing beside me, not before me and not behind me, for whatever is still to come." He kissed her then, in the dusty yard among the bleating goats, with Renshaw and Prout looking politely away and Anders Brandt grinning from his seat outside the soddy, and it was not a kiss born of desperation or rescue, but of two people who had each, in their own hard way, chosen to trust the other with the whole truth of themselves, and found it welcomed rather than feared. The 6 days before the hearing passed in careful preparation, Irene organizing the testimony and evidence with a journalist's precision, Daniel continuing his work with the goats each morning before riding to Belforge each afternoon to consult with Sheriff Cobb, and the lawyer the cooperative had managed to retain, a sharp young attorney named Wilhelmina Foss, who had built a small practice in the Black Hills defending homestead claims against larger interests. "Marsh will bring his own witnesses," Foss warned them, spreading papers across the Brandt family's rough table. "Likely men willing to swear the fire was natural, caused by lightning or careless prospectors, and he may attempt to discredit Renshaw and Prout as men bought for testimony, the same accusation he could level honestly enough against his own witnesses, though a jury does not always see the irony in that. We have the letters," Irene said, "in Marsh's own hand, addressed to Prout by name, discussing payment for the exact task Prout has confessed to performing." "That will carry considerable weight," Foss agreed, "provided the letters can be authenticated as genuinely Marsh's handwriting, and provided Renshaw's testimony holds firm under cross-examination. Marsh's lawyer will be aggressive. He will try to break Renshaw by suggesting he is protecting his own guilt in the original fraud by shifting blame onto Marsh, and he will try to paint Prute as a drunk whose word means nothing. Then we make certain Renshaw and Prute understand exactly what questions are coming, Daniel said. And we make certain the judge understands that two independent men, with no reason to conspire together, have each confirmed the same essential facts about Marsh's involvement, quite apart from anything my father did or did not do. The morning of the hearing arrived hot and still, the smoke of the earlier wildfire long since cleared from the sky, leaving a hard, bright blue overhead that seemed, to Daniel, almost mocking in its calm indifference to what was about to unfold below it. The Lawrence County Courthouse in Deadwood was a solid brick building, more substantial than the rough, false-fronted structures that lined much of the town's main street. And by the time Daniel and Irene arrived with Renshaw and Prute in tow, alongside Anders Brandt walking now with only a slight limp and a cane, and the Haverson family, and a dozen other members of the cooperative who had ridden in to witness the proceedings. The courtroom was already filling with spectators drawn by 2 years of rumor about the Cedar Spring dispute. Gideon Marsh sat at the defense table with his lawyer, a smooth, expensively dressed man named Bartholomew Reyes, who had traveled up from Cheyenne for the occasion, and Marsh himself looked entirely unworried, leaning back in his chair with the easy confidence of a man who had never once in his life been made to answer fully for his actions. Judge Ambrose Kirtland entered and called the proceedings to order, and for the better part of an hour the testimony proceeded along familiar lines. Irene's original evidence from the first hearing entered into the record again for context, the Haverson family recounting the threats and violence that had driven them from their original claim. It was when Wilhelmina Foss called Otis Renshaw to the stand that the true weight of the day began to settle over the courtroom. Renshaw, nervous but steady, described in careful detail how Gideon Marsh himself, not merely Elias Wallace, had approached him directly 2 years prior and paid him separately to falsify the survey plat, and produced, at Foss's request, a receipt Marsh had foolishly signed for the payment, believing at the time that no one would ever think to ask a mere clerk for proof of who had paid him. Bartholomew Reyes rose immediately to challenge the receipt's authenticity, but Judge Kirtland, examining it closely alongside the letters Daniel and Irene had recovered from the strongbox, noted aloud that the signature matched precisely the hand of several documents already entered into evidence from Marsh's own ranch correspondence. Correspondence Marsh's own lawyer had earlier submitted to establish an alibi for another matter entirely, and which now, ironically, served to confirm the very handwriting he was attempting to discredit. When Silas Prute took the stand, visibly trembling but resolute, and described in his own halting words how Marsh had paid him $40 to set the fire along the southern boundary of the cooperative's land, timed deliberately to coincide with the dry, wind-driven conditions of that particular afternoon, a murmur ran through the courtroom that Judge Kirtland had to gavel down twice. "You understand," Bartholomew Reyes said, attempting to salvage the cross-examination, "that you yourself committed a crime in setting this fire, and that you now stand to gain leniency by shifting blame onto my client." "I understand it plain," Prute said, his voice cracking but not breaking. "I have not been offered leniency by anybody, sir, and I do not expect any. I am telling the truth because there were children in that camp, and I have not slept a full night since, knowing how close that fire came to them. I would rather answer for my part honest than carry the lie any further." It was Daniel's own testimony, near the end of the proceedings, that seemed to settle the matter most fully in the courtroom's collective judgment. He described, plainly and without defensiveness, his father's role in the original fraud, his own suspicions that he had failed to act upon, and the discovery of the letters at the ranch house, including the confrontation with Marsh's men that same afternoon, which Irene corroborated in her own testimony immediately following. "I am not asking this court for sympathy on my family's behalf," Daniel said, looking not at Marsh but directly at Judge Kirtland. "My father did wrong, and I bear some measure of that wrong for my own silence at the time. But Gideon Marsh has continued to do wrong long after my father was in his grave, attempting first to intimidate this cooperative, and then to burn them from their land entirely. And I ask only that the court weigh the full truth of what has happened, not merely the portion that is convenient to any one party." Judge Kirtland studied the assembled evidence for a long moment: the letters, the receipt, the sworn testimony of two independent witnesses with no prior connection to each other or to the cooperative beyond the facts they had separately confirmed. And when he spoke, his voice carried the particular weight of a man who had heard a great many lies in his years on the bench, and had finally been given, in this case, something that rang unmistakably true. "This court finds," Judge Kirtland said, "that the original ruling awarding Cedar Spring and the surrounding acreage to the Cedar Spring Homestead Cooperative stands confirmed and permanent, with no further challenge to be entertained from any party. Furthermore, this court finds sufficient evidence of arson and conspiracy to defraud on the part of Gideon Marsh to refer this matter to the territorial prosecutor for criminal proceedings, and orders Mr. Marsh remanded to the custody of the Lawrence County Sheriff pending trial on those charges." The courtroom erupted, some in triumph, some in shock, and Gideon Marsh's smooth confidence finally cracked as two deputies moved to take him into custody, his lawyer already beginning to argue procedure and appeal even as Marsh himself was led from the courtroom, his face gray with the particular fury of a man who had never once believed the consequences of his actions could actually reach him. In the midst of the celebration that followed outside the courthouse, Irene turned to Judge Kirtland's clerk with one further matter, a proposal she and Daniel had discussed at length in the days before the hearing. "Your Honor," she said, once the courtroom had quieted enough for her to be heard, "the cooperative does not wish to see the surrounding ranchers, many of whom depend on grazing land near Cedar Spring through no fault of their own, ruined by this ruling either. We would ask the court to consider ordering a water-sharing agreement, dividing the spring's flow on a rotating schedule between the cooperative and the legitimate ranching operations in the district, so that justice for the homestead families need not come at the cost of hardship for every rancher in the county, only for the man who committed the fraud." Judge Kirtland regarded her with evident surprise and something like respect. "That is an unusually generous proposal, Miss Ellsworth, coming from the party who fought so hard to win this ground." "It is not generosity, Your Honor," Irene said. "It is simply what honest dealing looks like, when honest people are willing to share what the land can actually provide, rather than fighting over more than it can give." The judge agreed to draft the water-sharing order within the week, to be administered jointly by the cooperative and a committee of the district's ranchers, and as the crowd began to disperse into the bright Deadwood afternoon, Daniel found Irene standing slightly apart, watching the courthouse doors where Marsh had been led away, her expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. "You did not need to offer that," Daniel said, coming to stand beside her. "You had won everything already." "Winning everything is not the same as winning rightly," Irene said. "I learned that from watching my own father lose our homestead in Nebraska to men very much like Marsh, when I was younger than Peter Brant is now. He never wanted revenge against those men, only fairness, and he never got even that, because he died before any court ever heard his case. I did not want to become the kind of person who wins by taking everything from someone else, even someone who deserves to lose a great deal." Daniel took her hand there in the dusty street outside the courthouse and did not care who saw it. "Your father would be proud of what you have built," he said. "I am certain of that, though I never had the honor of knowing him." "And your father," Irene said gently, "made grave mistakes, but I do not believe he raised a son without honor in him, whatever else he failed to teach you. You have proven that 100 times over these past weeks, Daniel, in ways that had nothing to do with proving anything to me at all." They rode back toward Cedar Spring that same evening, the whole cooperative traveling together in a loose, celebratory procession, and it was somewhere along that dusty road, with the sun setting gold over the pine ridges and the goats' bells clanking faintly in the wagon where the herd traveled, that Daniel Wallace finally asked the question he had been carrying, unspoken, since the moment in the yard 6 days before when Irene had told him she loved him. "I have no ranch left to offer you," he said. "No name worth carrying proud, no fortune, nothing but a talent for herding goats I did not know I possessed a month ago, and whatever honest work I can build from here forward." "I have never wanted any of those things from you," Irene said. "I have a homestead article to finish, and a cooperative that will need defending and building up for years yet, water agreement or no, and I find I do not want to do any of that without you somewhere close beside me." "Then let me ask it plain," Daniel said, reining his horse to a stop on the ridge overlooking Cedar Spring. The whole valley spread gold and green below them in the last of the daylight, the tents and the half-built cabin and the goats grazing peaceful now that the danger had passed. "Marry me, Irene. Not because I have anything grand to offer, but because I have learned, watching you, what an honest life actually looks like, and I do not want to build one anywhere else, or with anyone else, for the rest of my days." Irene looked at him for a long moment, her eyes bright with something that was not quite tears and not quite laughter, some full and complicated joy that held both. "Yes," she said. "I require one thing more of you first, though, before I say it entirely settled. Anything. Promise me you will keep herding those goats," she said, and this time the laugh broke free entirely, warm and real. "Because Peter Brant tells me you have become the best hand this cooperative has ever had with them, and I will not have my husband abandoning honest work merely because he has become a married man." "I promise," Daniel said, laughing now himself. Something loosened in his chest that had been wound tight since the day he rode up to a chained gate, a ruined man with nothing left to his name. "I intend to keep herding goats for this cooperative until I am an old man too stiff to climb the rocks after them, and I intend to build a small, honest herd of my own besides, on whatever ground the water agreement leaves for a man willing to work it fair." They were married 3 weeks later, in the last warm days of September, at the edge of Cedar Spring itself, with Anders Brant standing as witness alongside Sheriff Cobb, and the whole cooperative gathered in their best clothes among the cottonwoods that lined the water. Irene wore a simple dress the Havorson women had helped her sew, and Daniel wore his one good shirt, mended at the collar, and Peter Brant led the goat herd in a wide loop around the ceremony at a distance, bells clanking softly, which struck everyone present as exactly the sort of blessing Cedar Spring itself would have chosen to give, had it possessed a voice of its own. The water-sharing order Judge Kirtland had promised arrived that same month, dividing the spring's flow between the cooperative and the district's remaining honest ranchers on a schedule fair enough that even Tobias Reyes, watching from the livery in Belle Fourche, allowed that it was the first piece of good sense the territory had produced regarding that spring in 3 long years. Gideon Marsh stood trial the following spring and was convicted of arson and conspiracy to defraud, and sentenced to a term in the territorial prison, his own ranch broken up and sold to satisfy the damages owed to the cooperative and to Renshaw and Prout both, who each received a small settlement for their testimony and their trouble. Daniel Wallace built his own modest herd that autumn, a mixture of goats bought cheap from a struggling homesteader further south, and a small handful of cattle he purchased honest, with wages earned rather than inherited, on a section of leased ground the water agreement had set aside for exactly such purposes. Irene finished her long account of the Cedar Spring fraud and sent it east that winter, where it was published to considerable notice, and helped, in the years that followed, to change how several territorial courts handled similar water disputes across the Dakota plains. And in the evenings, when the work was done, and the goats settled for the night in their pen beside the small cabin Daniel and Irene built together on the rise above the spring. The two of them would sit together on the porch step and watch the last light fade gold over the hills. Irene often with a notebook in her lap working through some new story that had caught her attention, Daniel content simply to sit beside her. No longer a ruined son carrying a name too heavy to bear, but a man who had found, in the last place he ever expected to look, a woman who had required nothing of him but honesty and a life's work that had turned out, against every expectation he once carried, to suit him perfectly. It was Irene who said it best, one evening in early October, watching the goats settle beneath a sky gone deep violet at the day's end. "I used to think I would spend my whole life fighting men like your father and Gideon Marsh," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I never once imagined I would end it married to a Wallace herding goats beside him at the very spring I once had to fight his family to save." "Life has a strange sense of humor," Daniel agreed, wrapping an arm around her. "I insulted you in a dusty yard once, believing myself untouchable. I have spent every day since trying to become a man worth the second chance you gave me instead of the ruin I deserved." "You are that man now," Irene said simply, and in the quiet certainty of her voice, Daniel Wallace heard the truest verdict any court could ever have handed down, and found himself, at last, entirely and gratefully home.